Breaking news from Washington, D.C. Ein Elbersog. The world held its breath. The air was thick with anticipation as journalists scrambled to cover the unfolding drama, and every television screen seemed to flicker with urgent updates. The stakes were high, and the global community watched, knowing that the outcome could reshape the world economy. The United States and China, the two largest economies on the planet, were locked in a bitter and escalating trade war. Negotiators met behind closed doors, their faces tense, as the world's financial markets reacted with wild swings. Investors and ordinary citizens alike wondered what the future would hold. Headlines screamed about tariffs, retaliatory measures, and economic uncertainty. President Trump's administration imposed massive duties on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods, vowing to protect American industries. The news cycle was relentless, and anxiety rippled through boardrooms and households alike. The goal was clear: bring manufacturing jobs back to America and punish Beijing for what were seen as unfair trade practices. But the consequences were immediate and far-reaching. Global supply chains, painstakingly built over decades, were suddenly thrown into chaos. Factories sat idle, shipments were delayed, and uncertainty became the new normal for businesses around the world. Multinational corporations faced a stark choice: absorb crippling new costs, pass them on to consumers, or find a new way to operate. Executives pored over maps and spreadsheets, searching for alternatives, as the world's attention remained fixed on the standoff between Washington and Beijing. Another nation quietly prepared to seize the moment. Vietnam, a country once ravaged by war and long associated with struggle, was now turning global disruption into a golden opportunity. Decades of careful preparation, investment in education, and a clear economic vision had set the stage for a remarkable pivot. The country's leaders had worked tirelessly to modernize infrastructure and attract foreign investment, laying the groundwork for a new era. As companies scrambled to escape the punishing tariffs, they found a ready and willing partner in Vietnam. The nation offered political stability, a young and energetic workforce, and a government eager to welcome new business. Foreign investors were greeted with open arms, and factories sprang up seemingly overnight, humming with activity. The result was nothing short of transformative: a surge of wealth, jobs, and opportunity that began to reshape not only Vietnam, but the entire Southeast Asian region. Cities like Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi blossomed with new skyscrapers, vibrant communities, and a sense of optimism. This is the story of how a trade war's unintended consequences sparked an economic boom for a resilient underdog, forever altering the balance of power in the global economy. Confronting China on trade was not just a campaign promise for Donald Trump, it became a defining pillar of his presidency, shaping both domestic and international policy. From the very beginning, Trump made it clear that he saw China as a major threat to American economic dominance, and he was determined to take bold action. The America First agenda was more than a slogan, it was a rallying cry for a new era of economic nationalism. Trump's supporters cheered as he vowed to bring jobs back to the U.S. and hold foreign competitors accountable. The Trump administration accused China of a range of unfair trade practices, alleging widespread intellectual property theft, forced technology transfers from American companies, and heavy state subsidies that gave Chinese firms an unfair edge in global markets. These accusations fueled a growing sense of urgency in Washington. The massive and growing trade deficit with China was held up as undeniable proof of a deeply unbalanced relationship. Year after year, the U.S. imported far more from China than it exported, raising alarms about lost jobs and declining industries at home. In response, the Trump administration turned to tariffs, taxes on imported goods, as a way to level the playing field and put direct pressure on Beijing to change its ways. The goal was to make Chinese goods more expensive in the U.S., encouraging American consumers and businesses to buy domestic products instead. Starting in 2018, the U.S. imposed tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods. The list quickly expanded to include electronics, machinery, furniture, clothing, and more, touching nearly every corner of the consumer market. The scale of these tariffs was unprecedented in modern trade history. It sent a clear message to both allies and rivals. The old order of free trade without consequences was over, and the U.S. was willing to disrupt global supply chains to protect its interests. The Trump administration believed it held the upper hand, convinced that China's deep reliance on access to American consumers would force Beijing to make major concessions at the negotiating table. Tariffs became a high-stakes negotiating tool, designed to inflict enough economic pain on China to secure a better deal for the U.S. But the strategy also carried risks, as American businesses and consumers began to feel the impact of higher prices and disrupted supply chains. This marked a dramatic shift from decades of U.S. policy, which had favored engagement and cooperation with China, in hopes of gradual reform. Now, confrontation and competition were the new watchwords. Trump made it clear, the era of unchecked Chinese economic expansion was over. He declared that the U.S. would no longer tolerate what he saw as one-sided trade deals and unfair competition. Each new tariff announcement sent shockwaves through global markets, rattling investors in boardrooms from Wall Street to Shanghai. Uncertainty became the new normal as businesses scrambled to adapt to rapidly changing rules. The trade war had officially begun, redrawing the global economic landscape. Companies around the world were forced to rethink supply chains, investment plans, and long-term strategies. The world watched with bated breath, uncertain how far the conflict would go or what the ultimate outcome would be. Allies and rivals alike braced for the ripple effects. The stakes had never been higher for global commerce. With billions of dollars and millions of jobs on the line, the world entered a new era of economic uncertainty, one shaped by the high-stakes gamble of tariffs and trade wars. The tariffs' impact was immediate and profound. Global supply chains, long centered on China, were shattered overnight. Products assembled in China became far more expensive to import into the U.S. Companies faced logistical and financial nightmares, scrambling for alternatives. This sparked the China Plus One strategy, diversifying manufacturing beyond China. Executives searched for countries with low labor costs, stable governments, and solid infrastructure. The race was on to reconfigure supply chains built over decades. Stock markets grew volatile, reacting to every trade war development. Businesses delayed investments, paralyzed by uncertainty. The tariffs punished China, but collateral damage rippled across the globe. The era of predictable low-cost manufacturing was over. A new, more complicated chapter in global trade had begun. In a swift and decisive move, China responded to U.S. tariffs by imposing its own set of tariffs on a wide range of American goods, signaling the start of a tit-for-tat trade war that would soon send shockwaves across the global economy. Beijing's countermeasures were carefully chosen, targeting some of the most vital U.S. exports: soybeans, pork, automobiles, and aircraft. These industries weren't just economic powerhouses, they were also deeply tied to regions and communities that depended on them for jobs and stability, making them especially vulnerable. For American farmers, the impact was immediate and devastating. Many had spent years building relationships with Chinese buyers, only to see demand for their crops vanish almost overnight. Fields that once promised prosperity now became sources of anxiety and uncertainty. Soybean prices collapsed, leaving mountains of unsold crops in silos. With nowhere to sell their harvest, farmers turned to federal aid programs just to keep their operations afloat, highlighting the deepening crisis in rural America. Major manufacturers like Boeing and U.S. automakers suddenly faced new trade barriers, making it harder to compete abroad. Meanwhile, European rivals seized the opportunity to fill the gap in the Chinese market, further eroding America's competitive edge. The pain of the trade war rippled outward, touching not just big corporations but also small businesses and workers. Factories in the Midwest slowed or shut down, and protests erupted as communities struggled to cope with the fallout. U.S. industries that relied on Chinese components found themselves squeezed by higher costs and supply chain disruptions. Small business owners faced tough choices as expenses soared and markets shrank, threatening their very survival. The ongoing cycle of tariffs and counter-tariffs fueled deep uncertainty. Stock markets swung wildly, business owners hesitated to invest, and headlines warned of escalating economic risks. Instead of shielding American industry, the trade war often had the opposite effect. Factories closed, workers lost jobs, and once thriving main streets grew quiet as businesses shuttered. Across the country, business was disrupted, costs rose for everyday goods, and countless livelihoods were put in jeopardy. Families faced tough decisions as layoffs and uncertainty became the new normal. The interconnected nature of the global economy became clear. Despite efforts to separate supply chains, the world's economies remained deeply intertwined, making it nearly impossible to isolate the effects of the trade war. The fallout from the trade war was both widespread and unpredictable, touching every corner of the country. Communities large and small felt the strain as uncertainty lingered. In the end, it was American workers and farmers who bore the brunt of the conflict, facing not just economic hardship, but also the emotional toll of an uncertain future. As the US and China clashed, companies sought new manufacturing homes. Vietnam emerged as the top destination for supply chain relocation. Its proximity to China made transition smoother. Final assembly could move to Vietnam while sourcing parts from China. Vietnam wasn't just an alternative, it was a complement. The country offered a young, educated, and motivated workforce. Labor costs were significantly lower than China's, keeping companies competitive. The government welcomed foreign investment, streamlined regulations, and invested in infrastructure. Vietnam's pro-business stance created a stable environment for long-term investment. While the world watched the giants, Vietnam quietly laid out the welcome mat. It was a masterclass in turning crisis into opportunity. Vietnam's rise was no accident, it was decades in the making. The Choi Moi reforms of 1986 shifted the country toward a market economy and global trade. Vietnam signed free trade agreements, lowering barriers and attracting investment. By the trade war's start, it was one of the world's most open economies. Massive investments in education and infrastructure created a skilled workforce and modern logistics. Vietnam's patient, long-term strategy set it apart. When companies looked for alternatives to China, Vietnam was ready. The seeds of today's boom were planted years ago. Now, they were bearing fruit. The corporate exodus to Vietnam triggered an economic transformation. Foreign investment surged, fueling a construction boom and new industrial parks. Vietnam's GDP growth soared, often exceeding 7% per year. Exports skyrocketed, especially in electronics and machinery. Vietnam became a manufacturing powerhouse, now a top exporter of smartphones. Millions of new jobs lifted families into the middle class. Industrial hubs thrived, wages rose, and optimism spread. The boom created a virtuous cycle of growth across society. Vietnam was no longer just a tourist destination. It was a global economic player. The trade war had become a powerful catalyst for Vietnam's rise. Vietnam's rapid ascent brought new challenges. Illegal transshipping, Chinese goods relabeled as Vietnamese, drew U.S. scrutiny. Vietnam cracked down, tightening customs and imposing penalties to protect its reputation. Rapid growth strained infrastructure and raised environmental concerns. Traffic, power shortages, and land prices became pressing issues. The government faced pressure to balance growth with sustainability. Vietnam's trade surplus with the U.S. also drew attention, risking new tariffs. Navigating great power politics became essential. Vietnam had to prove it was a responsible, reliable player on the global stage. Vietnam knows its current boom may not last forever. The country is focused on securing sustainable prosperity. Deepening global integration through trade agreements is key. Upgrading infrastructure and moving up the value chain are top priorities. Vietnam aims to attract high-tech industries and invest in education. Diplomatically, it balances relations with both China and the U.S. Bamboo diplomacy keeps Vietnam flexible and resilient amid great power competition. The goal: build a dynamic, adaptable economy, not reliant on any single partner. The trade war gave Vietnam a powerful push, but its own strategy will determine lasting success. The quiet winner of the trade war is determined to make its victory permanent.